Crabbe's Journal 22. The cop brought my parents in a few days later. Nurse Owens got the honor of leading the prodigal son down another hallway through a couple sets of swinging doors to a single door with lounge painted on it in very unlounge like letters. I stopped just before Mrs. Owens reached for the door hander. Wait, I said, I don't want to go in yet. She turned to me searchingly, right into my eyes. I thought I caught an understanding flicker in hers. She walked back the way we'd come, her loose uniform sort of floating on those skinny old bones of hers. I stepped up, looked through the small pane of the door. My parents were standing in the middle of the empty lounge, close together, not talking, surrounded by chairs and sofas covered in cheap pastel plastic. Harsh morning light splashed in through the panoramic window, filling the room with a white glare. Outside, the wind shook the trees that stood in lonely rows. My mother had on her full-length mink, as usual, but something looked wrong. My eyes were drawn to her thin legs. They were bare. And on her feet she had a pair of old, scuffed chestnut penny loafers that she wore around home when she was puttering about the garden, tying and clipping the roses on those rare moments when she seemed relaxed. But here, she was wearing them in public, with her mink. This woman, who wouldn't answer the door to pay the paper boy unless she was made up and dressed like a rich dowager from a lost empire or something. When I thought that unkind thought, my eyes rose to her face. The hard light in the window was not kind. She looked old. Skin tight over her cheekbones and sharp nose, but a bit loose under her chin, wrinkles around her tired blue eyes. She was pale and worn. There was no joy in that tight, rigid face. My father had on one of his dark pinstriped lawyer suits, not quite so well dressed, pressed as usual. A bit wrinkled, in fact. He looked a little heavier around the middle note, a little grayer around the top. My father had a round, healthy looking face with brown eyes and a wide, thin lipped mouth that made him look friendly but tough. This day, he simply looked careworn and old. You know, I never thought of my parents as people who would get old, but as I saw them looking so isolated, standing together in the middle of that room, my father with his arm around my mother's thin shoulders, staring out the window, they became suddenly people to me. People getting older, looking worn and beaten down at this moment. What was going through their minds, I wondered. Why had my mother faced the world in such a state, barefaced, bare-legged, in mink and gardening shoes? What a son of a bitch you are, Crabbe. What a son of a bitch, I said under my breath, to bring them to this. Tears streamed from my selfish eyes over my selfish face. I sobbed, my fists clenched in shame. I wept for the guilt I had caused them to feel. I couldn't face them, drowned in shame. I turned and headed quickly down the hall, bursting through the first set of double doors. Stop, Crabbe. It was Mrs. Owens. She stood in the hall blocking my path. Quickly, I wiped my eyes. Let me go by, I spluttered, and my voice cracked, childish. No, she said gently. You have to go back. You have to. You have to tell them it's not their fault. But it is, damn it, I shot back, shouting. It is their bloody fault. A young nurse with a bundle of laundry in her arms was approaching us. She looked aside and scurried past. Miss Owens said nothing as she took my rigid arm in her skinny hand and turned me around. She began walking me back slowly. You don't think that. If you did, you'd not be crying, Crabbe. Those tears are your guilt, and it's grief speaking to you. I stopped, pulling my arm free as my anger flared. What do you know about it? I snapped, immediately regretting my outburst. I'm sorry, I said quickly. I didn't mean that. Of course you didn't, she replied. She began to shepherd me along again. You're not such a bad young fellow, you know, she said. Those old eyes of mine see more than you think. I've watched you in the few days you've been here, playing checkers with those old fellows that nobody wants to bother with, that nobody visits, but maybe on a Sunday, running to their truck shop for them on errands. Oh, you're not perfect by any means. You can be nasty if it pleases you, to yourself most of all. She was probably remembering the time I bit her head off because she wanted to get me back to bed and take my temperature when I was in the middle of a conversation about canoes with old Ed, who lived in the bed directly across from mine. I realized later that it was Ed she had wanted to rest. But you've got something inside you, Miss Owens continues, as we walked slowly back along the hall down the lounge, that has to get itself born again. I've raised 5 kids, Crabbe, 3 of them boys, and I know the signs. If you want to be a man, you've got to get things straight between your parents and yourself first. Yeah, be a man, I said bitterly. You sound like my father. We stopped. She turned to me, dropping my arm. Well, yes, there's a lot of nonsense mixed up with that idea, to be sure, but it's not such bad advice, you know. You do have to learn to be a man. You must decide what being a man means to you, and you needn't take your dad's definition by any means. Miss Owens paused and looked right straight at my eyes, crossing her thin arms on her chest. You see, young man, it's like you were a seed and there's new life inside the shell, but it has to break the shell to get out. And when the shell splits from the force, well, that's a confusing and hurtful time. It's different for all of us, but we all must break free. She took me by the shoulders, turned me to face the door, and said, Now it's time to go and do what must be done. I could hear her walking away down the hall in the opposite direction as I stood there facing the door. I knew if I wanted to, I could scratch the whole idea, never see him, go away as soon as I got out of the hospital. After all, I had no legal reason to see them again. But all that was excuse making. I had to go in. I owed it to them and to myself.